Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. Black Cake jumped out to me when I came across it online while searching for books to read, largely because my family's from the Caribbean. My mother bakes black cake or fruit cake every year around the holidays, and this jumped out to me in part because I read a lot of books about Black culture. Primarily books based here in America, some in Europe, and quite a few from various African countries. But books that meet my review criteria and take place in the Caribbean or have some ties to the Caribbean tend to be fewer and far between. So when I came across this book, I immediately recognized Black Cake as a Caribbean thing and was intrigued. The book is pretty much about a family. A woman, Eleanor Bennett, who was married with 2 children, a son Byron and daughter Benny. The siblings are quite a number of years apart in age. They were once close as children, but over the years and now as adults, they've become estranged. When the book begins, Benny had a falling out with her family some years before and has had very little contact in the time since. But the 2 siblings are drawn back together when their mother passes away following a period of illness. Now coming together, they're forced to deal with each other in the aftermath of their mother's passing, as she left a video for them to watch and has some things about her background and her life that she would like to share with the children. At the core of the story is the exploration of identity, who we are, meaning who we are as individuals, how we see ourselves, how we show up in life, versus the expectations that other people have for us, how other people see us, and who they think we should be. At the center of the story is Eleanor, as she kind of ties together the past and the present. The story starts off with a little bit of background on how the 2 kids came to be where they are now in this period of having this strained and distant relationship. Where when they were kids, they were actually quite close. Benny, being the younger sibling by several years, looked up to her older brother Byron. He wasn't necessarily a second father, but more like the die-hard older brother, someone that she could go to with her problems and someone that she could talk to, that she could rely on. But when Benny was in college, and in the years since, she kind of went on her own path that's quite different from what was expected by her parents. During college, there was a heavy emphasis by their parents that Benny and Byron would go to school, they'd go to college, get good grades, and then go on to achieve and be successful in life. There's an expectation for them to achieve. And Benny pretty much upsets the apple cart by making good grades, yes, going off to college, but then ultimately deciding to drop out, which catches the family by surprise. She dropped out of school with no real explanation as to why, or a real explanation as to what her plan was for the future. And adding insult to injury, at least from the perspective of her parents and brother, is that she dropped out of school and then went on to kind of pick up one thing, get into another, and then at one point, she picked up and moved to another part of the country, moved out of the country in pursuit of a creative education. She studied cooking abroad, then she moved elsewhere, studying creative skills and things related to art and whatnot. And so it seemed like, at least from a fairness perspective, where they had an expectation of a linear path that the kids would follow, or at least not that they would pick up this and pick up that and whatnot, moving from thing to thing. It wasn't regarded as the thing to do. The family started to kind of give her the side eye as a matter of there was no explanation, no understanding of what was going on with her. They looked at it as she was not necessarily she'd lost focus, that she was lost and just kind of jumping from one thing to another. And so with that, it kind of impacted their relationship in that they weren't necessarily supportive of what she had going on up to this point, right? The family meaning between the parents as well as between the siblings as well. There was intimacy, closeness. And so it's seemingly overnight, this person becomes a whole other person. And so they were caught off guard by her kind of taking this giant leap off of the expected path to doing these random different things. It's that was one thing, but then during another visit home, Benny, after years of returning home for the holidays, breaks and things like that, but never really speaking about her romantic life, who she's dating, or introducing her parents or her brother to anyone, her dad had inquired as to what was going on. They wanted to know more about what was happening in her personal life, in her life outside of academics. They kind of got a sense that things were going on in Benny's life that they weren't privy to. Like, she was making these different moves with regards to her education, with regards to her future, but not really explaining things to them. And then to add to this, that she'd never introduced them to anyone that she'd been dating or brought anyone around or even just mentioned anyone. They were a little bit uncomfortable, right? Because up to this point, the family had been so close. And now here you have it that there are these various facets of Benny's life that her family doesn't know anything about. And so with nothing else to go on, they started to kind of push for more information. And it ends up being this thing of where, number one, Benny drops out of school. Then she's moving about to pursue these different creative interests. You know, there was an expectation for her to complete school, to go on, have a great stable career. But instead, she's like working a variety of odd jobs, like a waitress and these other things. Not to say that there's anything wrong with these types of jobs, but rather that it didn't fit the expectations that her parents had for the kids. They looked at it as she had so much potential and did quite well in school. It's not like she struggled as a student. Suddenly to just drop out, and from their perspective to be lost and directionless, flittering from one thing to another, they felt that she wasn't living up to her potential. And with no explanation as to what was going on, it made them push for more information. When Benny did decide to share aspects of her life with them, which was that the person that she was seeing at that time was actually a woman, you know, that in and of itself would have been shocking to her parents, given that up to that point, there was no indication that she might be interested in women. It was just assumed, they were expecting that if she brought anyone home, that it would be a man. So there was some discomfort there. But added to the confusion was that in explaining that she was involved with a woman, Benny made a point to express to them that this is who she was seeing at the time, but it was possible that in the future, she could also be seeing a man, indicating to her family that basically she was bisexual. And unfortunately, it seems that maybe it was a matter of her parents or her dad being caught off guard and of a different time, not really knowing much or understanding about Benny's life. And then suddenly having these preconceived notions about Benny, these expectations for Benny and what her path and future would look like. You know, they expected a more traditional path for her. And with Benny now making these changes seemingly out of the blue with regards to her education, with regards to her professional career, her personal life, it just threw her dad for a loop. And his initial reaction was to be upset and to express this confusion as anger, or his confusion came out as anger. The book explores the sense of hurt that she felt, where there's this thing that you hear sometimes of hurt people, where unbeknownst to her family, Benny had some very negative experiences at college with regards to trying to fit in. She was actually assaulted by some classmates, and it made for a very troubling experience. This thing of her trying to fit in, people were trying to push and force her into particular boxes, and finding that she wasn't what they thought she was or what they thought she should be. Not just her experienced rejection, but violent rejection. And adding to that, she went through these things at college and did not share these experiences with her parents or even with Byron. And so when she came home and began to share aspects of herself with her parents, like other parts of her life, these people that up to this point she'd been so close to, she also felt rejected by them, where she felt they sat in judgment of her. It felt like it was just building upon what she'd experienced at college. This thing of people having expectations of her and then very passionately rejecting her attempts to be her true, authentic self. Keeping in mind that at this time, she would have been maybe in her late teens, early 20s or so. And it's a period during which a lot of people are exploring. They're out on their own in the world for the first time, learning about who they are, trying to figure out who they are at present, who they want to be in the future. And so they try and they experiment with different things. And here it is that Benny was trying to explore her identity, trying to get a sense of herself and develop some sense of comfort with herself to figure out her place in the world. You know, and she was rejected at school. And then when she comes home, she also experiences rejection there. And it's a very hurtful experience. Her dad reacting so strongly to her, pretty much telling him about her, at the very least, being bisexual. You know, his response is like to storm off. Her mom, Eleanor, felt that it was her place and her responsibility as her husband's wife, never mind that this was her daughter, to go and see about his feelings and his emotions when he stormed off. So basically, it's like they're meeting up for Thanksgiving dinner. Benny tells her parents, and by way of that, also Byron, about her sexual orientation or her current relationship status. Her dad storms off in anger after having said some unkind words to her, and her mom's reaction after having been married to their dad for several decades at this point and, having been together for the better part of their lives at this point, is that she felt it was best for her to follow him and see to his needs, but it ended up making Benny feel as though her dad had rejected her and her mother supported this rejection. Where in the past things would happen in Benny's life that she would be able to turn to her parents and, to talk to them about, to turn to her brother and talk to him about, here it is that she finds herself seemingly rejected by both of her parents, and then she also feels a sense of rejection from Byron as he pretty much sides with their parents as well. There's some miscommunication, and things aren't handled in the best way possible, because part of it is that her father was shocked by this news. But in no way did it mean that he didn't love her, he didn't want to have anything to do with her. Really what it was that he was caught off guard by this information and just needed time to process it. But his reaction in the moment was heartbreaking to Benny. And feeling rejected once again, after having had these previous experiences, her reaction was to remove herself from the situation. How her family reacted was incredibly hurtful to Benny. And instead of lashing out or anything like that, her response was to distance herself, really for self-preservation. Her dad really just needed time to cool down and get himself together. When he was ready to reach back out, not that long after, to speak more calmly to Benny, he attempted to find her in the house, but found that she'd already left. And it was the beginning of an estrangement between the family members, where it fractured in two, Benny off by herself feeling alone, while her parents and Byron were another entity. The lack of communication, this estrangement led to a compounding of hurt feelings, where in time, because of these issues between them, it became more awkward and difficult to figure out how to bridge that gap, to figure out how to repair that relationship. And this is something that went on for several years. Unfortunately, Benny's dad, ended up passing away following a period of illness. And given how they left things, it was heartbreaking for Benny because this was still her dad. This was someone that she'd loved throughout her life. But given how things ended and then him suddenly passing away, she found it difficult to cope with the loss. It's like they say that there's always drama at weddings and funerals, in this case at her father's funeral, which just led to further compounding of their issues. These communication problems, right, where people are certainly entitled to their feelings, but they never really express to each other how they felt. They're not taking the time to sit down and discuss or work out their feelings, to explain their perspectives, or to gain an understanding of the other family members' perspectives. Quite often the solution was to walk away from the situation. And it's like sometimes in some relationships that is the best response, just because there's no reconciling the two perspectives, or the relationship is just so dysfunctional that there's no benefit to it continuing. But here, what you come to realize over the course of the book is that these are people that genuinely love and care for each other, and they can overcome a lot of these issues and problems, resolve a lot of these hurt feelings with communication. But there's some stubbornness at play where their feelings are so entrenched. There's an assumption that they have all the information, that they know everything, they completely understand the situation, while not realizing that they're operating with limited knowledge. They're missing some key facts, details that would largely change their perspective. And so you have this situation with Benny, but Byron as well, where Byron is kind of like the prodigal child. He started on the path that was set forth by their parents. He's exceeded their expectations. He's gone to college, completed his core studies, went on to graduate school, and now has a really great profession where he's a thought leader in his field. And in addition to that, as his parents get older and, start to become ill and whatnot, he helps to take care of them. He becomes a support system for them. Healthcare proxy, right? Taking on a lot of the family responsibilities and obligations, instilling a heavy sense of weight on himself, a heavy sense of responsibility on himself, and thus feeling some resentment towards Benny, because as time goes on, he's kind of struggling under the weight of all of these expectations. And he sees things as Benny being free to live her life, not really shouldering any of the family responsibilities or expectations. He resents this perceived freedom that's now part of Benny's identity. And it's like with this theme of identity, how we see ourselves, how our family sees us and their expectations, as well as how we're perceived out in the world. Byron also struggles with identity, where he's very much his parents' son. He lives up to their expectations and then some. He's a marine biologist and has built this career for himself, but is actually struggling within the organization where he works. As part of it is he's a black man. And when people look at him without prior knowledge, they don't necessarily, or without knowing his professional credentials, they make assumptions about him. They have preconceived notions about him, where he's large, he's athletic, like large in stature. And so it's like when people see him, they make assumptions about him. But their perspective changes when they find that, he has like this illustrious career as a marine biologist. He has a very large online presence. But as part of this story is we see these multiple instances or explanations of multiple instances of him having contact with the police, them looking at him, making assumptions about him feeling the need to lean very heavily into his professional identity as a means of hopefully putting people at ease, of kind of combating people's preconceived notions about who he is as a black man, these prejudices that they have towards black men. And so it's an interesting perspective as well, because you see that it's one thing to be ambitious, but you see he puts a lot of pressure on himself to be like the perfect man, the perfect professional, to be very aware and to make every effort possible so as not to make other people uncomfortable, to combat their prejudice, their preconceived notions. It's like instead of him living his life for him as an individual and doing what makes him happy, what makes him feel fulfilled, pursuing some of these goals that he has, he feels this pressure to be a positive representation of black men. It's one thing in the course of him just living his life to be a positive representation of black men, but he feels added pressure to not just do what's right for him, but to also consider what's for the greater good. So it's like to some degree, his life doesn't feel like his own. Quite often, it feels like he's living according to someone else's expectations or living up to someone else's standards rather than doing what would make him truly happy. And as part of that, you see him kind of like taking on all of this pressure onto his shoulders and feeling stressed, especially once his parents begin to get older and start to suffer with health issues, where he's shouldering the burden of these expectations and responsibilities. And so in comparison between the two siblings, there's this thing about expectations where one pretty early on casts them off, but then feels rejection because of it. And then you have this other sibling who, in hopes to be accepted, takes on these expectations, really burdens himself with them, and ultimately both end up being somewhat unhappy in their lives until they reconcile these things. And then at the center of the story is Eleanor. And there's like this generational thing of identity and expectations and familiar burdens, these pressures that are put on people. And when we look back over the life of Eleanor in her past, where she comes from an island, it's not specified within the book, but really the island is pretty much based on Jamaica. There's this conversation about her and her identity where I don't want to like spoil the story for you by getting into the details of what exactly is taking place in Eleanor's story, as there are some twists and turns there. But basically what happens with Eleanor is that things took place in her past where she had to leave her life behind, much as her mother had to do as well. Probably sensing that her death was near and wanted to leave some explanation to her kids, Eleanor took the time to record a video explaining her past, right? Telling her children her true life story, revealing some family secrets about both herself and some other family members. and really sort of coming to terms with who she was and explaining that to her children. Where certainly she was the person they thought she was. She was the mom who loved and cared for them. Their dad was their dad who loved and cared for them. And they had a really authentic relationship where they'd spent decades of their adult lives together. But in telling them the story of her life, she goes back to the beginning and reveals that there's some untruths that she's told, where it doesn't necessarily change the nature of her relationship with her children, but rather provides a better explanation of who she was as an individual before them. And it helps to put a lot of things into perspective and helps her kids gain an understanding of who she was in the past, where she came from. It ends up being a kind of bonding experience because they've all dealt with these pressures with regards to identity, having to hide who you are, trying to figure out yourself while also operating under the pressure of other people placing expectations on you and familial responsibilities. And it's this thing of people feeling the need to hide away pieces of themselves in efforts to protect themselves and just living within that struggle within the family because they're under this burden of expectations, this struggle to be your true authentic self. And so you see it as a generational thing where Eleanor's mother was married to her dad, and it reached a point where the marriage was unhappy and she felt compelled. She felt she had no choice but to leave the marriage. And the way she went about doing it would have an impact on Eleanor's life. Eleanor then, as she was a young woman, had a burden placed on her by her father with regards to his expectations for her, what her life should be going forward, her obligations, her familial obligations. And it led to her having to create a new identity for herself, separate from her father. It basically resulted in her being cut off from her father, being cut off from the rest of her family, and just about everyone else that she knew. And so it's a really interesting book that, as I said, explores identity. It's in a way that most of us wouldn't be dealing with these specific type of details, like having to literally run away. But I think there's a certain human element to it. This discussion of who we are as people and the expectations that are placed on us by our families, the expectations that are placed on us by our friends, and then the broader expectations that are placed on us by society, the assumptions that people make about us. And, with regards to how we're perceived in the world and then how people think we should be and function in the world. And I thought it was just a really interesting book. There's some twists and turns that make the story all the more interesting, but really what connected with me was this thing of exploring identity. We learn about some of the secondary characters, such as Eleanor's childhood friend, her husband, as well as her parents. And then with Benny as an adult, we see the interactions that she has at college, some of the people that she's dated, some of the people that Byron has dated as well, a woman in particular that he's dated, and unfortunately at the time of the book, the relationship has ended. And it's like you get some insight into those secondary characters and how they interplay with these three primary characters. And it just all combines to make a really interesting story. And with that, I think the book is really good and I highly recommend it. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.